Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our lecture for the third module of Chapter 2, which is our chapter on our research methods and designs in psychology. So this is going to be a very short module. It's only 4 slides. I am, just to keep it consistent, going to count this as one full day of class. As you'll see, some of the lectures will be maybe a little bit longer than the 15-minute period, hopefully not, but ones like these might only take 10 minutes. But this will be the lecture material for Monday, September 21st. So our third module in this chapter is on ethics in psychological research. So basically we're going to talk a bit about how over the years psychology as a discipline has introduced ethics guidelines into their research. As you'll notice when we talk a bit more about the social psychology, which is in the second course if you continue on with me, sometimes the research that we have done, particularly in that area of psychology, might not necessarily be considered the most ethical. So we will talk a bit about what kind of guidelines and things have been put in place to kind of keep researchers in check. So as psychologists spend much of their time discussing and debating which procedures to use in the collection and evaluation of data, they're also very concerned with the ethical principles that govern these research procedures. So above all else, we're trying not to do harm, whether that's psychological or physical harm, to the participants in our research. The CIA's top secret project MKUltra was basically a project that began after the Second World War. The US government had concerns that some other countries were basically trying to use kind of mind control techniques and other really kind of manipulative torture tactics in their training for their armies and things like that. And so basically what happened is the US government figured that they should kind of keep up with the times, and they took a lot of people and exposed them to some really unethical kind of procedures and treatments. So using shock therapy set at really high levels and other things like that to try to basically do what amounted to torture with the participants, to try to see if they could kind of get information from them. So it was a very extreme example of why ethics guidelines can be so important in a research environment. So again, we want to ensure that in our psychological research we are doing the least amount of harm possible to our participants. So today, all Canadian institutions that engage in human research must have a Research Ethics Board, or an REB, which is essentially a committee of researchers from that institution, as well as some officials that are charged with the protection of human research participants. So REBs are intended to protect in 2 ways. The first is weighing the potential risk to participants against the possible benefits of the research, and the second is requiring informed consent, which is a very important part of the research process, and we'll get a little bit more into detail about that in a minute. So basically, informed consent refers to the fact that a potential volunteer or a potential participant in our research must be informed of the purpose, the tasks, and the risks involved in the study, and they must give their consent to participate in the research without pressure. So in order to be truly informed, we must make sure that participants know the topic, the nature of the stimuli that are going to be used within the research, the nature of the tasks they're going to have to perform, the approximate duration of the research, any potential risks, as well as the steps taken to minimize or mitigate that risk. Physical risks, of course, are rare in psychological research. The more common types of risks that we as psychologists are concerned with would be possible cognitive and emotional stressors, so more of a psychological risk to the participant. So for example, one such risk would be mortality salience. So any research we do that's talking about death and dying, it kind of might bring into play that really strong kind of idea that, death is something that is inherent and that it's coming to us, and sometimes that can be upsetting for participants. Another potential cognitive stressor would be writing about trauma. People who are asked to write or speak about traumatic experiences, again, that can kind of bring up some really kind of negative feelings and emotions that are associated with that experience. So again, in that case, we want to make sure that we're trying to minimize those risks where possible. Sometimes, and particularly in social psychological research, which I will give a lot of examples of just because that is one of my fields of study, it is necessary to use deception, which is basically misleading or only partially informing participants of the true nature of a hypothesis or hypothesis being studied. So obviously, if we want to study how someone would naturally react in a situation, if we tell them exactly what it is we're studying and kind of what we're hoping to see, then they're probably going to give in to those demand characteristics we talked about last class, and that's probably going to affect how they interact and how they perform in that research. So sometimes we need to deceive them and kind of not really let them in on the true nature of the study, but it is very important that when deception is used, it is only short term, and that the participants are informed of the true nature of the study once it has ended. So we have something called debriefing, which is really important. It's an important step of the research process where after a participant engages in a research task, we kind of bring them in, sit them down, and explain to them what it is we were doing and why, especially in the case where deception was used in our research. So in order for full consent to be obtained, participants must have the freedom to choose. So they must be able to choose whether or not they would like to participate in the research. They must have equal opportunities, which basically means that if, for example, I give you, a link to a survey that you can participate in as part of a bonus assignment this semester, I also have to provide you with a written alternative. So I can't basically say, here's a survey, it's worth 1% of your mark. If you choose not to do it, you can't get that mark. I have to provide you with an equal opportunity, because otherwise that might be kind of pressuring you to participate in that research, and you might not necessarily want to do so. You also must have the right to withdraw at any point during the research process, including, even right at the end. If you're uncomfortable with what's going on, you can withdraw your consent at any point. And finally, you must have the right to withhold information. So if we're asking about topics of a sensitive nature, you need to be able to withhold information and, choose not to answer a question, because obviously we don't want you to have to talk about things or participate in something that's going to make you very uncomfortable. And then also after participation, and I just kind of spoke of this in the last slide, there must be a full debriefing. So the researcher has to explain the true nature of the study, including the nature of and reason for any deception that was used. Then we have a final measure of protection for participants, which includes anonymity and confidentiality. And these are a couple of things I talked about way back in the first part of this chapter when we discussed the types of bias that can occur during research. So ensuring participants that their data will be kept anonymous, so you're not able to identify what data belongs to any particular individual, and also that it will be kept confidential, so nobody's accessing that database unless they absolutely need to be. Those two things not only help to kind of minimize the risk of bias in research, but they also help to protect the participants as well. We also take measures to protect the rights of any non-human animals used in research. So there are boards that are very similar, or committees that are very similar to those research boards, and they've been established by a lot of hospitals and universities who are engaging in non-human research. And so basically these committees are responsible for the ethical treatment of animals. So they monitor basic care, they minimize pain and discomfort, and they ensure that any pain that does have to be inflicted in research can be justified. So again, that the benefits outweigh the costs. Finally, the last thing that I wanted to mention here with respect to ethics in research is concerning ethics in data. So once the research has been completed and we have a data set available, we should keep that data for a certain amount of time. So you can't just basically conduct research, take your data, and then decide that you're going to publish that data and then burn that data set. You need to keep it around because, as we mentioned, one of the major criteria for good scientific research is the ability to replicate. So you have to keep that data set available in case any other researchers want to try to replicate your results or maybe do their own analyses with it. So once the data has been reported, either in a journal or at a conference, we need to keep that data for a reasonable amount of time. This relates to the public nature of good research. Scientists must be honest with their data. Unfortunately, there are sometimes cases of scientific misconduct that occur when individuals fabricate or manipulate their data. And I had an old professor in my second year of my undergrad when I took a research methods course, and he was vehemently opposed to any kind of manipulation or fabrication of data. It was his number one pet peeve, and he made some really interesting analogies to how severe he considered data manipulation to be. So really, we need to make sure that when we're collecting data, we're using the data as presented. We're not trying to manipulate them to suit our needs. And of course, we're not just making up data out of thin air. So a very well-known example of scientific misconduct took place in 1998. You may have heard the name Andrew Wakefield before. He was a British physician who basically wrote a paper that linked the MMR vaccine, which is a very common vaccine given to people in most developed countries when they're growing up. And he stated in his paper that that vaccine was linked to autism. Unfortunately, that result was picked up by some celebrities and kind of disseminated to the general public, and everyone made this big fuss about it, and in reality, that data was actually manipulated. So if you look at the original data set and the data that he collected, his conclusions were pretty much completely unverified by his data, and in fact, he did later on lose his license. He could no longer practice as a physician, and it came out that he actually had a financial stake in the fact that he was trying to develop something else to kind of take place of that vaccine, or kind of basically he had a financial stake in people not taking that vaccine. So basically what happened is that he had manipulated the data to make it look like the vaccine was connected to autism, and to this day we still have a very strong kind of group of people who are unfortunately very misinformed, but they really strongly believe that vaccines are linked to autism, and that has created a whole bunch of further health issues, especially in the United States and even here in Canada. So we really need to make sure that the data that we're using is valid, it has been collected in a reliable and valid way using reliable and valid measures, and that we're not manipulating the data or fabricating the data to make it look any certain way. So we need to be truthful with our data. So that is basically it for Module 3. It's, like I said, a very short module, only 4 slides. I've done this as a video lecture, but I think going forward, I'm going to move to audio only. I noticed that the lectures that I did up last night for the first and second module, they are very large files. They're about twice the size of the audio only ones, and it's going to take a lot more time to process and get those uploaded. However, I will post a little poll at the end of these first 2 chapters on our page to ask you which you preferred. If you really strongly felt that having the little video in the corner was kind of helping with your understanding, then I'll try to keep doing so. But if not, I will probably proceed with audio-only lectures from here on out. So I will post that poll within a couple weeks once we get a chance to get through some of this material. But for now, that's the end of the lecture for the 21st of September, and I will see you shortly in the next video where we'll discuss the 4th and final module of this chapter. So we're going to get into a little bit of statistics primer. It's not going to be anything complicated, but basically just explaining what kind of statistics we use to look at our data and help us analyze it and come to conclusions. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.